Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks. We've been waiting for a few folks to join in. Looks like the participant and attendee list is continuing to grow, but let's go ahead and get started. Very excited to have everyone here today. My name is James Hunt. I'm one of the co-founders of BINC, and this is we really enjoy doing these webinars. There's so much that BINC as a company we learn from from the various projects and engagements that we do over the last 10 years, helping companies at different stages and through all types of hiring scenarios. And we look at these webinars as an opportunity for us to share a lot of those learnings out and give back to the community that we're excited to be a part of. And so really excited to have everybody here today. So today's webinar is going to be So You Think Your Interview Process is Inclusive by Natalie Dunnage. Before we get into kicking that off, just a couple things to let you know. If you have any questions at any point, feel free to use the chat box. You can also use the Q&A box. You can mark yourself as anonymous or not. And then at the end, our moderator, Kirsten, will lead a Q&A session just after the presentation. So feel free to put those questions in. There will be a couple times where either a poll will be a part of the presentation, and you'll have an opportunity to click on an answer for the poll. And then we'll have a section where we'll be asking you a question. We'll be asking for you to share some of your insights and experiences as well via the chat box. And then finally, before getting into the introduction of Natalie, just wanted to put out there, we have a great diversity of people in terms of functional areas attending today. Everything from talent leaders to recruiters to hiring managers and business leaders. If you're comfortable and you'd like to know a little bit about your fellow attendees, feel free to throw it into the chat box, your current role, so that we can create a little sense of community within the chat, but only if you're comfortable. And with that, let me introduce Natalie. So Natalie is a recruiting director at BINC, recruiting director in our San Francisco area. She's been with BINC for 4.5 years and has worked with a variety of great companies and through a variety of hiring scenarios, as mentioned before, during that time. She's also played a huge role in forming our approach and strategy to diversity, equity, and inclusion at BINC, as well as how that carries over into the work that we do for our clients. A couple things to note in terms of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee was formed just a few years ago, about 3 years ago. Natalie was one of the co-founders of that committee and really sort of setting the stage and kicking off the work that we would do around DEI for BINC. She was instrumental in building out our ERG framework, Employee Resource Group framework, as well as a whole string of trainings and discussions and dialogue that we were having with employees. That's really extended to a lot of the work that we do for our clients as well. Natalie cares a lot about inclusion and fairness and has worked with many companies over the years in helping them set up an inclusive process to ensure a better candidate experience and, of course, more hires. Natalie's also very involved in various external partnerships in the communities that she's involved with, both personal time invested as well as bringing that connection back to BINC here in the Bay Area, including but not limited to advocacy in the neurodiversity community. And with that, I am very excited to hand it over to Natalie to teach us about inclusive interview process.
All right, thank you so much, James, for the kind intro, and thank you, Kirsten, for moderating. Appreciate it. So I figured a good place to start is why listen to me or why listen to BINC in the first place? Who are we to say what does or doesn't work? So as James mentioned, over 3 years ago, we started our DEI committee. Prior to that, there was a large group of us working with a client. And this particular client had several issues around inclusivity and passing on candidates for things that had nothing to do with the role. So at the same time, we're facing our own internal struggles. Our company, which had been primarily male dominated, now had almost 50% female employees. And with that came communication issues and power struggles. But most importantly, no one had a clue how to solve this. or the issues on the client partnership side. So it was ultimately our awareness of how incredibly unaware we all were that prompted us to start looking at the type of emotional growth we needed to do as a company before we could coach anyone externally on how to handle these challenges, much less create an inclusive interview process. So then we formed our DEI committee, and with that DEI committee came several trainings and initiatives, and not all well received, but that prompted more feedback, more introspection, and more difficult conversations. Over this time, we have continuously revamped our hiring process and took our learnings to some of our clients to help them with theirs. And honestly, if you had told me over 3 years ago at Bank that we would be able to talk openly about so many sub areas of DEI and have this foundational knowledge to improve our clients' hiring process by making it more inclusive, I'm not entirely sure I'd believe you, but here I am giving this webinar, and I can say with confidence that we might have learned the hard way, but we definitely have learned a lot, and today I'd like to share some of those learnings with you. So just a quick disclaimer here, this training does not include every single way you could make an interview process inclusive, and that would be amazing. This training has areas I've often seen missing from the process during my time working with a large variety of startups. The goal is that regardless of your recruiting style, you have at least one takeaway you can use to improve your existing process. So starting at the ground level, what's inclusivity? It's a practice or policy of including people who might otherwise be excluded. Some examples of this could be candidates who identify as autistic, LGBTQIA, Latinx, and so on. But why is it important? So there are far more reasons than I will mention today on why inclusivity is important. I could probably devote an entire training, a whole weekend on just the why. But here I'll just share some key reasons. So according to Lightspeed 2018 hiring trends, 93% of startups feel they're behind on diversity hiring. 41% of startups missed their hiring goals in 2017. So how do the other half of those companies reach their hiring goals? Well, by creating an inclusive interview process, you're expanding your candidate pool and the reach of your brand. So when you introduce people with different experiences, backgrounds, abilities, and so on, you expand the impact of your product, making it more accessible for a larger population. And then by being inclusive, you improve the overall well-being of your organization, because through educating, creating awareness, you're fostering an environment of mutual respect. And that means individuals will have healthier ways of understanding and accepting differences instead of isolating each other and behaving defensively over those differences. And then when you create an environment where people can use their unique strengths, your retention improves. The year or so after we formed the DEI committee was when we experienced the least amount of attrition at Bank. And then another key reason is that fostering belonging helps build trust. People are happier when they feel safe, supported, and can speak openly about their experience. So now that we've covered some context, let's get into what everyone came here for, which is how do we do the thing? So the most common interview process I've seen is that companies open a role, post a job description, create interview focus areas, they screen, interview, and close the candidate. I haven't seen a ton of that in the steps that go before that or what happens in between those steps. And what I mean by that is how do we make those steps accessible to people who aren't exactly like us, and where would we even start? So to uncover that, we're going to do a quick poll. There are many ways to start this process, but one of the ones we've learned that to be most successful is either A, interview training, B, leadership buy-in, or C, unconscious bias training. And we'll just give everybody just a few seconds here to answer. Okay, so it looks like, all right, so 6 went with interviewer training. It looks we had 69% of people with leadership buy-in and 23% with unconscious bias training. So the answer here is leadership buy-in. So having had experience learning the hard way, but by not having executive buy-in, we've learned at Bank that messaging should come from the top. You really want a unified vision on why it matters and the steps you're taking as a company to be more inclusive. For example, when we first started having DEI conversations at Bank more than a few years ago, there were several people afraid to speak up, unsure if it would impact their job or others' perception of them, because we didn't have a clear unified message. So we have to keep in mind that a job is someone's livelihood, and while we should all hope you can speak openly about your differences, it's hard to know unless there's a unified message around it. So regardless of if we see it or not, there is a power dynamic when you're an employer, and wanting to keep your job can actually overshadow your ability to have open dialogue around topics like inclusivity if it isn't a clear priority to leadership. So if you don't do that, what will happen is you'll see a divide grow, if you haven't already, and that'll be between the people who can talk openly about inclusion and the people who don't. And this only isolates people further from one another and creates unwanted conflict as defenses rise between the two groups. Once buy-in and messaging happens, then you can educate people, you can implement changes, and you can have follow-up. So what we'll do now is dig deeper into each one of these steps so that you can see some of the additional ways you can improve your process to reach a larger candidate pool. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. So first up is leadership messaging. We already discussed the importance of buy-in, but then it's actually on leadership to discuss what steps the organization is going to take to make those improvements. So it's not enough to say this is important. You want to give actionable steps you're going to take. So if you think about elections, right, candidates are usually, not always, but usually held accountable in the public spotlight to not just saying what's important to them, but the plan they want to implement to make that change happen. And then if you're struggling to know how to get leadership buy-in, I would focus on areas I mentioned on one of the earlier slides about bolstering your brand, your reach, improving the well-being of your organization by increasing retention, which will ultimately reduce the cost of recruiting and give people awareness they need to collaborate in a more meaningful way. Also, there's just plenty of data out there to support your case just with a simple Google search. One cool stat to make your case is that in 2017, companies with below average diversity scores made an average of 26% from innovation revenue, compared to those with above average diversity scores who made 45% from innovation revenue. So that's nearly double. Now, moving forward to opening a role, common mistakes in posting job descriptions are using language that appeals to the demographic that posted the job description. An example here is not everyone finds language like "be a ninja" appealing when they're applying to roles. So you want to think about where you're posting your job description as well and what demographics most likely use that platform. An example here is that some websites have mostly male-dominated traffic. If that's where you post, then you can expect more male applicants than female. And then when it comes to accommodations, I've often seen that companies aren't thinking about how to accommodate and remove physical and environmental barriers until after they've had a candidate request an accommodation. So for example, one of our client engagements, a candidate asked how he would support visual impairment, and then everyone had to spend the rest of the week scrambling to figure out how to make that happen. And then a really important note here. So if you want to know how to support people through accommodations, you must proactively include the people who need them in the conversation. So I wouldn't ask a group of people who don't have autism as the final decision makers for how to accommodate for people who do. And then for interview focus areas, Providing an outline for candidates ahead of time on what to expect in their interview so that they best know how to prepare is incredibly helpful. Interviews are nerve-wracking and can cover a wide range of areas, and we shouldn't expect people to be mind readers. Providing candidates and interviewers with clear focus areas creates a better experience for everybody involved. So now we're moving on to the later stages of the interview process. Number one, train your interviewers. Without training your interviewers on what questions can we legally ask, what type of feedback is appropriate, how do they minimize their own bias when evaluating someone? So for example, they might focus on how much the candidate praised them and the company and very little on the actual skill set, which is what you need. By not training, not only are you creating an HR nightmare, but your interviewers won't have the tools and confidence they need to successfully navigate the situation that they've been placed in. And then another commonly missed opportunity is creating an interview panel that represents more than one or two demographics. Also consider how you're setting up that interview. So there was a situation early on in my time in recruiting where there was a female candidate coding and there were 3 male interviewers standing over her while she was coding. The recruiter managing that candidate had to explain to the interviewers why that made the candidate uncomfortable. So consider again, power dynamics, your body language, number of people involved, and how that can prevent what could have been a good interview experience. And then during your screens and interviews, you want to solicit feedback. So each step of the way from candidates. This will help you improve your process and course correct. It also helps prevent people from complaining online if you're proactively providing them a space to voice their concerns. And then when thinking about skill set, so there are a couple areas here that have come up for us when working with various companies. So the first is, if you are actively recruiting from underrepresented populations, remember that not all people have had the same opportunities. There are varying degrees of accessibility and systemic issues that prevent the brightest people out there from attending places like Harvard. And often companies assume that because someone didn't go to a certain place or have a certain degree, that they aren't capable. And you'll want to reflect on what is most important to assess to get the job done, not what school they went to. Have an interview process that focuses on the core competencies someone needs to be successful. For those nice to have skills, you can also consider what you're willing to train on. What is the type of mentorship you'll need to have in place to support that training? If you don't do these things, what will happen is you will burn through your pool of candidates very quickly and waste a lot of money on recruiting, trying to find a magical person who checks 10 boxes when you could have already hired and trained the person who had the ability to pick up the nice to have skills quickly. And then the second point I'll make about skill set is that I've seen many companies get caught up in things like how much eye contact someone makes or how outgoing they were during something like a technical interview for a role where they'll be behind a computer most of the day. Now, if it's a role where you're greeting people for a living, or you're simply hiring someone to stare into your eyes all day, then by all means, set those expectations early and often. But if this is a role that involves looking at a screen more than it involves looking into your eyes, then maybe hiring an extrovert could be counterproductive. Ultimately, that skill set you are looking for should match what they will be doing day in and day out. So weigh how much of that role is interpersonal versus technical before you start passing on people. And then a mishap I've seen pointing to a process that isn't inclusive is not taking into consideration that certain cultures don't encourage things like eye contact, while others reward it. This has no bearing on the person's ability to do the job. And I've also seen candidates get passed on because they were too confident. Something to keep in mind is that certain cultures encourage and embrace being overly confident in interviews. And it doesn't hurt to go an extra mile to do a little reading and understand how those differences show up in interviews. When I personally think about accommodations at the on-site interview stage, I like to consider areas that will impact any mobility, mental health, or physical differences. So for example, my least favorite thing in the whole wide world is fluorescent lighting. 39 million people in the US experience migraines. 29 million of those have light sensitivity. So that doesn't even include the population that suffers from seizures or sensory disorders impacted by lighting. So honestly, I don't even know why it's still a thing. A potential solution here is if there are outlets in your workplace, something as simple as using lamps instead of fluorescent lighting, or rearranging your space for natural light can actually make a huge difference in someone's comfort level. And then other accommodations can include limiting the amount of time on site. You know, people have families and loved ones they're taking care of, and they have jobs and income that's impacted by really long on-site interviews. And this will just create extra stress for the candidate. At the final stage of the hiring process is closing. So everyone involved has more than likely worked really hard to find the right person, retain them in the process, and now they're ready to extend an offer. I've noticed cultural differences sometimes impacting the closing process during my time evaluating interviews. And an example here is that certain cultures have more than one decision maker involved, or more than one person impacted by the decision to get the offer. And you really don't want to wait until you extend an offer to find that out. And then accommodations at the closing stage could be extra visual, auditory support going over the offer, or having a clear path to getting their visa needs met. And often I've seen a lot of like convoluted visa processes get in the way of a good candidate experience. So now that we've covered some ways to increase inclusivity in your hiring process, we want to hear from those who are willing to share about what types of barriers do you face in hiring or being interviewed. An example of facing a barrier could be, for example, I'm a visual learner and often interviews don't have any visual aids to guide me through the process. Or as a manager, maybe your barrier is everyone in the interview panel are in the same demographic, and that makes it hard to attract candidates who are different from us. Our moderator, Kirsten, is going to read your answers off of the chat feature in Zoom, and then I'll go ahead and hand it off to you, Kirsten.
Thanks, Natalie. We had our first response, and it's breaking newer hiring managers away from school, company bias, and focusing them on skill-based calibrations and interview process.
Yeah, okay, that's a great comment. I've actually seen that hurdle quite a bit when working with clients, and we had a guest speaker from Pinterest talk about their internal study over there and how there was actually no correlation between what school someone went to and how successful they were at the company. And often if you're getting a group of people who all go from the same school and those are the ones that were hired and they're the ones that are successful, you likely have bias in your interview process for those schools. So again, some simple research here will definitely point you in the right direction. But what I really like to do is take the data from the interview process and look at what are the profiles of people that are getting rejected versus passed through. What are the profiles of the most successful people on the team, and really compare that data to make a more educated decision. But again, there's been no correlation between what school you go to and the success you'll have at your job.
And I got a couple more streaming in. Some individuals are equipped to conduct interviews via Zoom or Skype.
Yeah, absolutely. We do a lot of Zoom interviews at Bank because we have quite the distributed team. We used to have a lot of us in the Bay Area, but now we're in a lot of different states. So I would say using Zoom is a great tool for offering remote interviews, and also helps ease some of the stress for people who have those other obligations outside of work and are struggling to find time to do those long on-site interviews.
Our next one is managers and interview panel not being aligned on job requirements, so candidates end up being inadvertently used as guinea pigs for figuring out what the company really wants or needs.
Oh, good Lord. Yeah, I could see the way that would be a struggle. I would say keep in mind your candidate pool, right, is only so big. You know, if you're having to hire recruiting in the first place, chances are the roles you're recruiting for are difficult to fill for some reason, right? So that's where that prep work and that calibration in the beginning is so important. And I will say that maybe your first few on-sites, you do learn some things that you didn't realize, and you use that information to improve the role. But that's why getting candidate feedback at every step is so important as well, so that you can continue to do that. But do as much prep work as you can ahead of time, because you don't want to waste the candidate's time or your time doing a process that doesn't get you the results you're looking for.
And I think we have time for maybe two more. The next one is not having diverse interviewers available, so the whole panel ends up monolithic.
Yes, absolutely. That's actually a big struggle, even for companies who want to hire a diverse group of people, want to increase the diversity within their current space. And they're struggling to do that because it's just one group of people there, right? And so I think having honest conversations with candidates about what you're trying to do and how they can be part of making that change if they're interested. But most importantly, just being transparent about your shortcomings with candidates. Sharing, you know, your awareness of the makeup of your org versus, you know, withholding it and the candidate just seeing like that's how it is, will always yield better results with candidates. And most candidates want a transparent company and want to see some level of self-awareness.
And the last one we have time for is many times hiring managers want to hire diverse talent, but not yet aware about how to ensure the interview process is inclusive.
Yes, absolutely. I think this is where the consulting with different demographics and groups outside of your org is so important. Again, you can't really know how to make something inclusive for various groups of people without including them in on that conversation. So if you want to attract diverse talent, well, what does diverse mean to you? What groups are you looking to hire? Those are the groups you should be reaching out to, talking to, and getting feedback from to ensure that your process works for everyone and not just your current group. All right, cool. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for chiming in. Really appreciate it. So I'll go ahead and move on to the next slide here. So here are areas to avoid. I've gathered through my time volunteering, teaching interview skills, gathering candidate feedback, and assessing different stages at companies. So we don't want to try to intentionally trip up a candidate. Remember, it's really easy to complain online to the masses. Someone can be a stellar candidate and still miss the intention of a question if it's worded poorly. One helpful tip I learned from studying assessments is that if a large majority of people are failing a question, it's the question, not the candidate. This is also a reason why tracking your conversions across your interviews is so important to ensure that you're being clear with your intention. And then let's not ask candidates to be charming over a crowded lunch during the pressure of an interview. So speaking as someone who has ADD, if you put me in a crowded lunchroom, I'm not going to be able to filter out all the extra noise happening around the people speaking to me while I'm trying to be charming and somehow gracefully shovel food in my face. If people seem a little off during their lunch, it might be due to the environment they're in. And then think about if the behavior actually impedes the ability to do the job. So does shifting, fidgeting, or rocking impact someone's ability to be on the phone or perform a task? So I once saw an interviewer give someone a poor score because the person was fidgeting with their pen during the whole interview, even though the person was able to answer all the questions. So again, we just want to make sure that we're testing on what makes sense for the role. Also try to narrow down what you want to test on as you're interviewing people. I once had a role where they wanted to test someone in 6 different areas, and only 50% of those areas were actually going to impact the person day in and day out on the job. And then lastly is brain teasers. So we've all seen all sorts of astonishing and sometimes amusing brain teasers given to candidates, and many large companies who have been using them for a while are starting to move away from them. But some people leave companies and they start hiring elsewhere and introduce some of those poor practices because it's what they know. And brain teasers are sometimes riddles or convoluted questions that test a person's problem-solving skills in a way that has no relevance to their role. Unless the role, of course, is solving riddles day in and day out. And in that case, then definitely test on it. So moving to areas to educate on. As I mentioned previously, when training interviewers, a large part of that should be around feedback. So is that feedback submitted right away, or is it submitted after they've had a chance to speak with their peers and have outside influence? Another area found is commonly missed is foundational DEI language. So I hear companies spend a ton of time looking up someone to teach unconscious bias training. But where I see a good starting point to education is giving people the language they need to express themselves in an appropriate way. So for example, how can I know if I'm committing a microaggression if I don't even know what that word means and how it shows up in interactions? And then how does an interviewer keep something offensive out of feedback if they've never been given the social awareness and language to do so? And then I see a lot of companies just assume that everybody knows what all of these things mean. But it's always good to make sure that like everyone's on the same page about it. And so once you've prepped, you got your buy-in, you've implemented, you've educated, what you're going to want to do is track your results. So how could you possibly know what you're doing is successful if you aren't tracking feedback, conversions, hires, and looking at how you're retaining people along the way? It's really easy to create an outline and say, this is how we do it. But if there's no accountability and following up, your work could actually go easily wasted. One client of ours had us track conversions of underrepresented populations against those who weren't at every single stage of the recruiting funnel. And we would have one-to-one conversations with hiring managers on a monthly basis about which groups weren't making it through. And then those conversations prompted deeper discussions around feedback that showed bias for one group over the other. And so again, without tracking, it's really hard to diagnose where your problems in the process truly are. Some reminders here. The 2 R's, be responsible and respectful. People are going to be nervous. You are judging them. Not being nervous would actually be weirder. And then please leave enough time. Consider how much time in a day a person will have to solve a problem on the job. If you're creating an interview process with problem-solving sections, be realistic about the amount of time you're giving them. And then leave time for a candidate to ask questions. I've seen this overlooked so much. Often we get so caught up in evaluating what they can and can't do that we forget they're evaluating us. And if you don't leave time for questions at the end of each interview, you'll end up with lots of extra steps to do so later on. And that just creates more scheduling for coordinators, more time candidates have to allocate to the process and away from their current obligations, which again creates more strain on them and on interviewer bandwidth. And then finally, learn to celebrate differences as strengths. The more your team develops awareness around communication styles and learning differences, the sooner everyone involved will have a more meaningful collaboration. And before you know it, then you're expanding your brand, your reach in new ways. And as I mentioned early on, when people get to play to their strengths and their differences are celebrated, they feel included, and you retain more employees, which results in less time on interviews and more time enjoying being with your team. So I just want to thank everyone for joining today's webinar. As I mentioned at the start of this presentation, not everything here may fit your style, but hopefully each person in attendance received at least one new tip to improve their existing process. So our key takeaways for today are, remember messaging comes from the top. to gain unity within your organization. Training doesn't happen one time. It is ongoing learning experience that is revamped through feedback and tracking results. Be reasonable. Interviewers are hard. We're all human. Most candidates are pretty nervous. And then focus on skill set. What does the person actually need to do the job day in and day out? All right, so thanks again to everyone for coming. You'll receive a follow-up email in a day or two. And if you have any questions, if you have any feedback, please reach out to webinars@binksearch.com. Again, that's webinars@binksearch.com. Now Kirsten is going to open it up to our Q&A for those who would like to stay, and then I'll do my best to address any questions that come up for you.
Thanks, Natalie. While we're waiting for the questions to roll in, I'm going to submit a quick survey poll for everyone. And if you have questions, feel free to enter them into the Q&A box or enter them into the chat box. The Q&A box, you can mark yourself anonymous if you wish to. We do have a couple questions that are coming in. The first is, how do you get buy-in from leadership?
All right, so in order to get buy-in from leadership, what I found is approaching the benefit of retention, saving cost on hiring long-term, presenting the data around how it impacts innovation. There's tons of articles out there with studies showing major benefits to businesses who have already done this. Hopefully that answers that question.
And the next question is, what sorts of things should be included in interview trainings to ensure that biases are avoided?
Yes, so I think step one, right, you want to have that foundational DEI language, have your unconscious or implicit bias training, but then also having a clear rubric that everyone agrees on is going to be used for grading those candidates. So sometimes we go in and we'll have clients who, you know, have an idea of how they want to test candidates, but they don't necessarily transfer all of that information over to the interviewers. And everyone's kind of testing for a slightly different strength based on what they want to see as an individual. And having something like a clear rubric for candidates and having those key areas in which they're tested in and what type of result do you need to see to know that that person is going to be able to do the job successfully will go a long way.
The next question is, you mentioned readings on cultural differences in how candidates present themselves. Any tips on particularly resources or keywords to Google?
So for key resources, I just do a simple Google search. We could probably share later today in Kirsten's email some additional helpful tips, but almost everything I've done, I just put in word for word in Google what I'm looking for, and there's just so much information out there now on DEI hiring practices and articles around this stuff. But I'll see if we can add something to Kirsten's email that she's sending out to everyone on stuff that I've used particularly to help with this training as well.
What's the best way to bring up a bias you believe someone on a panel has?
Yes, this is so bringing up bias that someone on a panel has it's a pretty tricky situation. The first thing is you want to assume positive intent. You don't want to assume that the person is behaving that way because they feel strongly towards, you know, one group over the other. Chances are they don't even realize that they're doing it. So a good conversation starter is using the data of the conversions at each stage and talking through, hey, I noticed that candidates with this background are getting put through, but candidates of this background aren't. And I just want to kind of talk this through and wondered if that was something that you've noticed is happening or if this is new information to you. And I think going in with positive intent, going in with the data to back yourself up, so it's not just hearsay, are really helpful. And again, just being an active listener in these situations will also help keep people from jumping to the defensive side.
The next question is, how would you counter bias towards older candidates at a young aged company?
Yeah, so that definitely involves, again, using the data, but also a lot of training and awareness should be developed around what are those differences, what are hurdles that an older demographic might be facing versus, you know, the younger generation. Just having really honest dialogue about stereotypes and hurdles, and then again making sure to track the results and holding people accountable to not passing on people at a higher rate because they're in a different generation.
Next we have, how did you determine diversity goals, and how do you recommend your clients determine diversity goals?
Yeah, so it's really specific to each company. The first thing I personally recommend is, what does diversity mean to that company? And then also challenging them, what are you hoping to gain from adding these different demographics to your company? Like, what do you want the end result to be? Is usually a good place to start for that. And then in terms of actual like numerical goals, what I've found to be pretty true and what I've heard from other conferences and things I've gone to is that you often need to double the amount of sourcing. So for example, if you're looking for, you know, 20% increase in underrepresented minorities within your group, then sourcing 40%, meaning reaching out, for those who are not sure what sourcing is reaching out to candidates. You really want to double the amount that you're actually trying to hit when you're reaching out to people.
And once you have data that shows some clear biases, what is the best way to present that to leadership and actually affect change?
Yeah, so I think this connects back really well to the question that was asked earlier about how do you have that conversation with somebody if they have bias, right? So again, assuming that everybody involved has positive intent, right? Everybody wants to make hires, and for the most part, I've just seen companies kind of, you know, people just get stuck heads down and don't always have the bandwidth or the ability to be as proactive about these things as they want to, right? And so you have to really make the case of, let's slow down for a minute, because long term, it might hurt us now to like slow down in the interim, right? Just for a minute and take a look at this stuff and see how we can improve. But long term is actually going to make our hiring so much easier. We're going to have so many more candidates to pull from. And then overall, our company is just going to be happier. You know, like at Bink, when we weren't doing these things, there was just, there was so much conflict over like things that were, I look back now, are like pretty relatively simple, right? And so it can be pretty short-sighted to not do this stuff. And you really have to see the big picture long-term. How much do you want to grow over the next couple of years? And typically that involves, you know, expanding your brand and reach. And in order to do that, you really have to look at the bias that's in your current process. How do you reduce it so that you can expand your brand and reach and hit those hiring goals that you're looking to make over the next couple of years?
And what are some ways to broaden the applicant pool to be more inclusive and reach diverse candidates? What are some recommended recruiting channels besides the large ones like LinkedIn, Indeed, and Glassdoor?
So the question was, how do you broaden your candidate pool outside of the traditional like LinkedIn's and Glassdoors? So I would start looking at different groups. For example, if you go on to meetups, right, you have like women who code groups. There are, or if you go to where, one of the places that I volunteer as a speaker at sometimes, or for interview skills training, is Ascend, which works with adults on the autism spectrum. And they're all in different spaces and field. Not everything is, not all of them in startups or tech space, right? And so you need to go and converse with those groups. You need to be posting your jobs where those groups will see them, and not just the traditional LinkedIn or Stack Overflow or wherever you're currently posting. It's really important to just, again, do some reading, do some searching for different meetups in your area, or different groups. LinkedIn also has the subgroups as well, where people get together and discuss things. It could be, I think there's like people of color in tech groups, or HR groups for people of color. There's like just so many different options, but the main thing is just making sure that you're gaining visibility there, and not just sticking to a couple different platforms that tend to have like the same traffic over and over and over again.
Great. And we'll take one more question. We still have a list of questions that are coming in. What we'll do is I'll give them to Natalie, and Natalie can write those answers, and we'll send it out to everybody with our email, the follow-up email. The last question is, how do you identify the difference between bias in hiring and simply realizing that the candidate is not a culture fit?
Well, I think here is a question around culture fit. So something we did at Bink was we changed culture fit, the language culture fit, to culture add. Culture fit kind of by default in a lot of ways introduces bias into your process. A culture fit is often judging somebody based on their personality. So when you're looking at culture fit, you really want to make sure that it's based on actual values that the company holds. And you also want to make sure that those values aren't exclusive. So for example, are your values based on only hiring extroverts? Well, what happens when you have a room full of extroverts? You have a lot of people yelling over each other, and it's not the most collaborative environment either. And then your product is only geared towards people who are extroverts. Yeah, you just want to make sure that your values match up with whatever you're considering as a culture fit. But I'd also encourage you to look at changing culture fit to culture add. How can people who are different actually add to the culture within your organization? Because adding people who are of different cultures is not going to detract in any way from your company. So again, just making sure there are also clear values tied to that.
And that's all of the questions that we have at this time.
Awesome. Well, thanks again so much for everyone attending. I really appreciate all the questions. This has been awesome. Again, so you'll receive an email from Kirsten in the next day or so from a webinar, you'll receive an email from Kirsten the next day or so. But if you have any comments or questions in the meantime, you can reach out to webinars@thinksearch.com. And all right, I guess we will stop there. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.